All right, and we are live.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second in the Joint Women's Leadership Virtual Series hosted by the Sea Services Leadership Association. Very glad that you are able to join us today. This will be a great session. We want to do a big thank you, first of all, to our sponsors who helped make this possible. So thank you very much to Johnson & Johnson, to USAA, and to Amazon. We very much appreciate them sponsoring and helping make this possible for us. Throughout the course of the discussion today, there will be some polls that will pop up for those of you watching on Zoom. We certainly ask that you participate in those. They will be anonymous. So if you would please register your answers as those pop up throughout the presentation. It will help inform us to know that we're giving you content that is relevant, interesting, and depending upon the results we get, maybe even something that would be valuable for us to give back to the services. So please take the time. Again, they will be anonymous. Also, just to get the disclaimer out of the way, obviously the views and opinions expressed in this webinar are solely those of the speaker and don't necessarily express the views of the Sea Services Leadership Association, the DoD, DHS, or any other uniform service. So with that, I'm going to jump in. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Jenny Storm. I am the president of the Sea Services Leadership Association. Have been a part of the board now for many years. Been in the Marine Corps for about 21 years. And so it is definitely my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. So Admiral Retired Jan Hamby, also known as Dr. Hamby. This is going to be a great session today. Not only does she have extensive experience in the Navy, 30 plus years of time in the Navy, and clearly has found great success as a woman in a male-dominated organization, reaching flag officer status. But she has had command across the globe. She has served any climb or place, as us Marines like to say. She has leadership experience not only in the military, but also in academia and in the corporate world. And one of the things that I found interesting as I looked through her bio is that her career, not only is she in a male-dominated organization of the Navy, but she's in a male-dominated career field of cybersecurity and information technology. So she has spent significant time championing those efforts and doing a lot for where the Navy now stands with their cybersecurity and telecommunications. So great experience, and it's wonderful having her here today. Now today she's going to be talking about toxic leadership, and as I mentioned, she is Dr. Hamby as well. And so she has extensive knowledge on this, not only from her leadership experience, but also that was the focus of her dissertation. So I know that she's going to bring us some wonderful, wonderful information. One of the things I always say is I hate to admire the problem. And I can tell you right now, we are not going to spend the next hour admiring the problem. But I know that Admiral Hamby is actually going to give us some great tools. And I look forward to it. And without any further ado, and not to delay this any longer, Admiral Hamby, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. And SSLA is an organization that's near and dear to my heart as well. So it really does bring me a great deal of pleasure to be able to be part of this virtual series, to share with you some of the really relevant findings that I discovered mostly, or I reached the conclusions mostly through the dissertation research that I did while I was working on my Doctor of Management degree. But they were also things that I had observed and kind of developed a sense for during all those years in the Navy and in the work that I've done out in the academic world, as well as Jenny mentioned, in the corporate world. The subject of toxic leadership is one that tends to get people's attention very quickly. People are very passionate about this subject, and they show an interest in it. Unlike many subjects that are out there, if you want to just talk about general leadership topics, a lot of people go, ho-hum, but you mentioned toxic leadership and people engage. And the reason I believe this is true is because toxic leadership is so dominant out there in the world. And it is a problem for us not only as individuals who experience being in a toxic leadership environment, but it's a problem for us in that if we want our organizations to succeed, we need to rely on the ability of our personnel to move us towards our organizational goals. And toxic leadership is a killer for that. So before we dive in too deeply, why don't we make it clear what we're talking about when we say toxic leadership? I want to be extremely clear that toxic leadership and toxic leader are two different things. The toxic leader is the individual who may have the behaviors that can lead to an environment which produces negative outcomes for organizations and their people. Those negative outcomes collectively represent an environment that is toxic in the longer term to that organization. And the leadership that is demonstrated is what generates that kind of an environment. So don't confuse the leadership with the leader themselves. Because if you focus on the leader themselves, then when you try and resolve issues around toxic leadership, you're going to be focusing on what you can do to that leader. And that's not going to get you there. What are the kinds of negative outcomes that I'm referring to? So as you can see there, the behaviors that would be demonstrated by the leader are things like incompetence and intimidation. And the outcomes include things like a tendency of the workforce to withdraw into themselves. They are responding to a toxic environment with whatever coping strategy they can come up with in order to survive. It's really important also to realize that these toxic leadership environments aren't necessarily pervasive across the entire organization. They're not necessarily generated by a toxic leader who's at the very top of the organization. And every organization that I've been experienced with has a toxic leadership environment in some nook or cranny within it. So it's really key to recognize that it is extremely widespread and it causes real problems for individuals as well as for the organization itself. I'd like to share with you a foundational concept that helps you see how you might be able to address toxic leadership if you know of it in your organization. And that is the toxic triangle. This is a concept that was developed. It was not necessarily instantiated by, but it was certainly developed into a form of maturity by a guy named Art Padilla. And he really put out a great article that walks through how you can't have a toxic leadership environment unless you have three things. You need to have the leader that is perpetrating the kinds of behaviors that will cause a toxic leadership environment to be established. But you also have to have an environment that is permissive to that development taking place. And then you also have to have followers who don't have the coping skills that make them less susceptible to falling prey to that toxic leader. So you need three things. You need the leader, you need susceptible followers, and you need that permissive environment. Now in the military, we have seen a lot of work go into trying to knock down the permissiveness of the environment. We've had leadership briefings, we've put out policies, we put out policies against everything from sexual harassment to intolerance of diverse peoples. We have requirements and regulations that address things like fraudulent reporting. We have things that the UCMJ itself is a form of a tool to try and prevent a permissive environment from existing. And yet we still see toxic leaders and toxic leadership existing out there. So you got to wonder, why is that? And we're going to dig into that a little bit deeper. We have also seen that under a toxic leader, people behave in a way that make things worse for the organization. And we've seen leaders who have been able to get away with murder and nothing's been done about it. So this all comes together and creates these situations that are horrible for individuals and they're bad for the organization. I'm very, very much stressing the fact that this is everywhere. It's not just in the military, it's out in the corporate world, it's in academia as well. And you probably see it in volunteer organizations that you're involved in as well. So I want to validate my own thesis on that right now. We're going to throw out a polling question for you. And basically, what I want to know is if any of you have ever experienced toxic leadership or a toxic leader. And that would include your current position. So if you can all quickly, those of you who are on Zoom, just respond to this poll that has popped up. I would appreciate it. We'll give it a moment or two. And then our very supportive staff is going to generate the results for us so we can see how this turns out. And I believe my premise will demonstrate that the findings, the evidence that we see in academic research, that up to 100% of people have experienced toxic leadership in their working careers is true. So if we can see what the results on that poll are in 3, 2, 1. Uh-oh. Oh, there we go. Look at that. 97% of you have either worked for a toxic leader or you've been involved in a toxic leadership environment. Only 2% of you have not, and 1% of you are not sure. Okay, I would say this represents a big problem for us, doesn't it? If 97% of us know that we have worked for a toxic leader, I will share with you that the 2%, you may have been exposed to a toxic leader and not realized it, and the 1% who don't know, I'm going to put you in the 97% group. Now, one of the reasons that 2% of you may have said no is you may not be focusing in on the aspect of toxic leadership that is actually represented by the incompetent leader, as opposed to the leader who is deliberately trying to do things in an abusive way that gets them ahead and disregards what happens to their people. So the incompetent leader is the leader who allows toxic leader kinds of behaviors or employee behaviors to take place. They're an ineffective manager, they're an ineffective leader, and they allow things to get out of hand within their organization. So if you have worked for a leader who does not make sure that people are held accountable to accomplishing their own the results for which they are responsible, and other people have ended up having to shoulder more than their fair share of the load, then you have worked for a toxic leader. There's also the disengaged leader who just isn't paying attention and allows things to take place that would contribute to a toxic leadership environment. So I bet if we were to reissue that poll, and we're not going to do that, but I bet if we were going to reissue that poll, then that 2% number might go away or might drop down to 1%. So that should be a lesson to all of you that as far as being a toxic leader, you don't have to be abusive to actually be a toxic leader contributing to a toxic leadership environment. Take that on board as you look at your own leadership methodologies. It's your responsibility to make sure that you have the capabilities and the competence needed for a good leader, and that you stay engaged so that you, in fact, are not contributing to a toxic leadership environment. Okay, so now we have a second polling question, and you can all answer this if you'd like, but it's really targeted at that 97%. I really want you to answer. I'm interested now that if you have experienced working for a toxic leader, what about the organization that you were working for? Did they tolerate the presence of that leader? Or were they doing things that would either suppress those negative behaviors of the leader or to move that toxic leader out? So has the organization allowed toxic leadership to take place without specifically addressing it because of the presence of a toxic leader? Maybe they didn't because they didn't even know that that toxic leader was there. Maybe they didn't because that toxic leader was getting the results that they needed. Maybe they didn't because they were afraid of how it might affect that person's career. Whatever the reason, I need you to tell me, did your organization allow it to take place or did it not? And we'll give you another second or two and then we'll wrap up the poll and we'll show the results. So 3, 2, 1. Okay, 81% of you who have experienced toxic leader were in organizations where their presence was tolerated. I'm going to make a quick little aside here. You're going to have to bear with me because the nature of Zoom these days is that those of us who wear bifocals, we can see at a distance, but if we're going to read something on the screen, we have to kind of like get our face right up in there for you. So bear, I thank you for your forbearance on that. Only 12% of this group said that their organization did not tolerate it. Wow, that is really disheartening, is it not? I would argue that intent to not to tolerate and actually not tolerating are two different things. And this difference, this distinction, helped lead me to my focus on personnel. Okay, we can close the results now, thanks. Led me to focus on personnel. If organizations are well-intended, but they are still not able to prevent toxic leaders, then what can we do about it? Well, before we examine that question, let's dig in a little bit further into the impact of these toxic leaders and the toxic leadership that we have seen and that we have validated exists in our organizations. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, here is a really high-level overview of the kind of impacts that toxic leadership begets. Now, I have to highlight that the results on the left and the results on the right both come from toxic leadership. With toxic leadership, you do get improved results. You do get improved personnel compliance, and you do get personal gain for that toxic leader. So you can see why toxic leadership might be tolerated. The problem is that these impacts tend to be very short-lived. So if you have a toxic leader, a toxic leadership environment, you will often see that personnel really do turn to and put extra effort into the work that they're doing. They are doing their best, basically, not to get yelled at or not to get in trouble and not come into the visibility of that toxic leader. Their coping mechanism is to try and do what the toxic leader wants as diligently as they can in order to avoid that kind of negative attention that they feel they would receive. As a result, the organization does benefit. But the problem we have is that over time, those folks who are dealing with this environment, who are living within it, find that their own internal emotional, mental, and even physical resources are degraded. And as they degrade, we hit the point where we start seeing things like burnout. We see people throwing in the towel and just going along with the toxic leader's pressures from above. We may see things like ethical lapses where they're willing to take shortcuts or actual fraudulent actions in order to deliver the kind of results that the toxic leader is relying upon, that is demanding from them. We may see workers start to drop in their own productivity, where they will only do as much as is absolutely required and spelled out for their production in order to try and not draw any attention to themselves. No one is willing to take a risk to step out and offer new ideas. No one is willing to step out and offer to help someone else, because in that process, they may draw that negative attention and negative energy to themselves, which will deplete their own internal resources even further. We see a loss of diversity, and the diversity I am talking about here is diversity of thought. We will see that no one is going to be willing. So when I say no one, I really mean most. Sorry. I have to be clear on that. We will see that most people will be unwilling to express their ideas because they don't want to be the target of having those ideas shot down, having those ideas ridiculed, having themselves be humiliated and put into negative light within their social group in the organization, within their work group within the organization, within their own sense of self-esteem within that organization. And we will also see a surge in employee bad behavior. The evidence is very clear that toxic leadership environments lead to an increase in employee bad behavior. I am not saying that every employee bad behavior is the result of toxic leadership. I am saying that toxic leadership will increase that amount of bad behavior. And that's really important, because if you have 95% of your population trying to do their job well and only 5% that are the bad apples, you have a pretty good opportunity that that organization is going to be successful. If, however, that number starts climbing up from 5% to 10, 15, maybe even 30, even higher for some of the more benign bad behaviors like withdrawal and disengagement, you're going to start seeing organizational results slip. You're going to see readiness slip. You're going to see capacity and capability of that organization drop. And that is something that we as leaders, especially in the uniformed services, must be very mindful of. Our job, much of it, surrounds the concept of readiness. And our ability to be ready to do an immediate task that is urgently needed is critical. If employee bad behaviors have been increasing to the point where that kind of readiness is put at risk, then we set our organization up for failure. And that would not be a good thing for the organization. It would be a much worse thing for the people that we serve. So this impact from toxic leadership is something that we can't sneeze at. It is very important that we try and address it as responsible leaders. We need to take on strategies that will allow us to prevent this impact from happening. Now, I've talked a little bit about what those impacts specifically are. I'd like to give you a little more concrete example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. Consider, for instance, the situation that we saw in Abu Ghraib, where we had toxic leaders who created an environment where showing off and humiliating prisoners was the kind of thing that got you noticed in a good way. And if you did not participate in those kinds of activities, you were shunned, you were pushed to the outside of the social circle, you got potentially lower evaluation marks, and so forth. And this pushed us into a situation where people gave up what were probably their own internal personal values of decency, and they adopted this group norm where they treated prisoners in a way that was an absolute violation of the Geneva Convention. As a result, our organization as a whole took an enormous hit in reputation, which I would argue probably led to a hit in terms of future readiness because it certainly set up some people to view the military as an organization that was wicked and that they would never want to work for. So the domino effect of toxic leadership and the impact on how employees and personnel behave has long-lasting effects. I'll let you offer another one. I won't cite a specific case, but it has always been of interest to me when I have read through the after-action reports and investigations on collisions at sea, how many of those collisions resulted when a helmsman or a junior officer of the deck or someone else who was on the bridge could actually see that the collision was approaching, but they were afraid to speak up and tell the captain that there was a problem. And as a result, the captain ended up moving that ship right into harm's way, sometimes with loss of life. Sadly, I've seen this happen too many times over my career, and it has happened recently. I am personally going to be very interested in seeing what the reports from the recent fire on Bohom Rajard reveal to us. And I would not be surprised if there is some element of this kind of dynamic taking place within that group. Okay, so with this backdrop on toxic impact of toxic leadership, we have one last poll question for you. And that is whether or not you have actually seen, have you been witness to the negative impacts that you could attribute to a toxic leadership environment? You don't have to be certain, but given what I have shared so far today, do you think you have witnessed negative behaviors, negative impacts that have been the result of a toxic leadership environment? I'll throw out there for you too that that negative impact could also be people deciding it's not an organization they want to work with, and so they quit, they leave. At the end of their enlistment, at the end of their contract, at the end of their tour of duty, they decide they no longer wish to be part of that organization. So 1 or 2 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. And let's see what we got. Okay, so 97% of you, again, have seen these negative impacts. All right, we'll close that. And I think that in these few minutes, you all must have embraced this notion that toxic leadership is not just someone's feelings getting hurt. It is a true problem for our organizations and for our people. Let's move to the next slide and let's see if there aren't some solutions to toxic leadership that are within our own control. That's the whole point of this talk today, by the way. It's to hopefully inculcate in your own thinking that you personally, individually, can do something about this. Okay, as we look at solutions to toxic leadership, I want to take you back to that toxic triangle. Remember the fire triangle that we all studied when we learned damage control and we worked on firefighting? You have to have oxygen, heat, and fuel in order to have a fire. And if you take any one of those away, the fire goes out. Well, guess what? With the toxic triangle, where you must have a toxic leader, susceptible followers, and a permissive environment, if you take away any one of those, toxic leadership environment will start dissolving for you. Okay, so that means we've got some options to work with. The first one, and the one that we instinctively always go for, is getting rid of the toxic leaders. I'm here to tell you folks, that is a futile endeavor. First, it's kind of like Lay's potato chips. Eat them all, we'll make more. There are so many toxic leaders out there and people who fall into the trap of toxic leader behaviors that eradicating the immediate toxic leader only gives you a short-term reprieve. you'll have another one inbound sooner than you think. Very unfortunate, but it is true. And maybe you want to view my outlook as a little cynical, but that's been my experience. And part of it's because they've been shaped and molded by other toxic leaders, but that's the subject for another entire speech. Okay, there are so many of them. Get rid of them. Another one's going to come in, but also it's really hard to identify them if they're one of those toxic leaders that has developed the ability to look great to their seniors while making life hell for their followers. So getting rid of the toxic leader, we're going to take that one off the table. Not a good option. All right, well, what about rehabilitating toxic leaders? That one is also futile, I would say, partly because of that identification problem. And then the other reason is because there are lots of toxic leaders out there, but each one has its own story of creation. And it brings you to a point where if you're going to rehab toxic leaders, maybe one's not so bad and you want to try and maybe bring them up to being a good leader so that they can contribute, well, guess what? You're going to have to put together what I would call a bespoke program to help them work through all of their issues and all of the things they need to learn in order to become a solid leader. I'll mention that those disengaged and incompetent leaders are probably the ones where this option shows a little bit of promise. And there are certainly individuals for whom this option would make good leaders out of a toxic leader, but they are few and far between. And as we know in our services, you fix one, they're going to transfer eventually, and you're going to get a new leader in. And I hate to say it, but the polling or the surveying and research done in the corporate world shows that about 27% of all leaders show some toxic leadership traits, if not lots of toxic leadership traits. And given that the military and the uniformed services are so hierarchical and provide leaders with a better ability to use a hammer, if you will, the expectation, although not proven, the expectation from theory is that the number of toxic leaders within the military of some degree is probably higher than that. So that makes this option pretty futile as well. Okay, if we can't take out the toxic leader, how about let's make sure that the environment can't support the toxic leader into the point where they develop toxic leadership environments. This is a very, very hard task to do. It is not impossible, but it is an approach that requires a level of consistency, a level of focus, a level of extreme senior leadership championing that makes it untenable for most of our environments. As I just mentioned, our leadership rotates. So if you lose the kind of support that you had for making your environment non-permissive, only 2 or maybe 3 years into that journey, the gains that you will have made are going to erode very swiftly. So it is doable, but it is very hard. I'm a pragmatic person. I like to do things that I believe are more likely to get results and to get good results. That's why I have recommended that we focus on reduction of follower susceptibility. This one is possible, and not only is it possible, but it has demonstrated very positive results in much shorter periods of time. Short enough that you can actually see results within your own division, within your own department, your own command, even if you only have a year and a half left to go, maybe even less. And guess what? When you work on reducing follower susceptibility to toxic leadership, you are also building follower ability to cope with many other kinds of stressful environments. And each and every one of us works in stressful environments. At sea, in combat, in the air, lots of stressors. You want people who are resilient and who are able to cope with stress well. So this is a twofer. You help them reduce their chance that they will adopt negative behaviors because of toxic leadership, and you enhance their ability to perform well in lots of other stressful environments. So how do we do that? Let's move to the next slide. Okay, you heard me mention the word resiliency on the previous slide. I'm going to drill down on it a little bit here. The key to reducing susceptibility in a follower is by building up that follower's resiliency. And resiliency is looked at as an intrinsic capability that an individual has to endure stressors without losing their mental and emotional resources that allow them to demonstrate positive coping skills and even to thrive in the aftermath of that stress. There is tons of evidence, tons of literature that supports this definition of resiliency and the result of higher resiliency yielding positive results. So this is where we're trying to go with this. This is all based on a framework that is called the conservation of resources theory. And it really shows kind of an economics-based assessment of people's internal resources. If they have to deal with a stress, that means they have to expend resources, and that starts depleting their own capacity. If they are able to do things that builds up their store of resources in the first place, or that puts them in a position where that deficit of resources takes place at a slower rate under stress, then that is what puts them in a position to think clearly, to act according to their own principles and values, to self-regulate how they respond in the situation, and to behave in a very positive manner. So what are the things that show us that someone is resilient? What are the things that we can work on to build resilience in our followers? My research showed that there are 3 key areas that we can work on to build resilient people. Now, my research also showed there are a lot of other characteristics of people that contribute to resilience, but they tended to be things that that we can't really focus on as leaders to develop within our people. So for instance, one of those things is having a positive personal affect. In other words, just your way of looking at the world is one that is more positive than negative in its own nature. We tend to frame the environment in a way that looks at challenges as opportunities instead of as something that we have to wrestle with. So, but how do you develop that? You tell someone to be more positive? That's not going to cut it. So my research tried to focus in on those things that we as leaders can actually work on. And the 3 things that I came up with was that in resilient people, we see that they demonstrate competence, a mastery of the skills and knowledge that goes into their business. We see that they can self-regulate. In other words, they have discipline to do the things that they know they need to do to be ready, to react, to respond, to act. So anything from being able to stay committed to an exercise program for your own health and well-being to being able to show that self-discipline where you hit the books to really learn what you need to know about your business. You kind of see an interplay there with competence. And then the final thing is the possession of self-awareness. So a self-knowledge about who you are, what you stand for, those things that you hold valuable, and an ability to remove your own observation of a situation from looking at it as from only your perspective. So if something is happening, you can kind of step out of your skin and assess the situation for what it is instead of for how it is affecting you. Or it's kind of like getting away from that victim mentality, or the, oh, someone frowned at me, they must be unhappy with me, as opposed to someone frowned in my direction. It might mean they're unhappy with me, but it could also mean a whole host of other different things. So this is self-awareness and mindfulness. And guess what, folks? All three of these characteristics can be developed. We'll go to the next slide. And I'm almost done with my part of this, and then we'll have some questions from you. If you develop these three areas, it is akin to giving your people a vaccine against toxic leadership. And turn it around. If you work on these three areas for yourself, that's you giving yourself your own vaccination. Competence is pretty darn straightforward. Now, of the three, it has a lesser contribution to resilience, but it is by far and above the easiest characteristic to develop in ourselves and within our people. And it simply boils down to making sure that your people have the opportunity to get the kind of training that they need for their work. The skills, the concepts, the different training courses, and extend it out beyond the immediate definition of their work. Include things like the some more philosophic topics for those folks who are becoming leading petty officers or NCOs. Make sure that they have an opportunity to learn about leadership. Make sure they have an opportunity to learn a little bit about psychology. Make sure they learn about things that broaden their own intellectual capacity, and that will spill over into their ability to absorb and develop their skills and competence within their specific work field. Okay, let's talk about self-regulation. Self-regulation really does help a person mitigate the amount of resources that they spend in coping with a stressor. It reduces the amount of resources that they must spend when they're faced with a stressor. And self-regulation is also able to be developed in a fairly direct manner. One of the things that the evidence shows is that for self-regulation, one of the easiest approaches is to do drills. Do them repeatedly. You know, we in the military, we know that you do drills so that when the emergency comes, you'll respond without thinking. You'll be able to do what is needed in the moment because you're not going through an internal debate about what is the right thing to do. Well, when you translate this over to the conservation of personal and internal resources, this kind of drilling practice, whether it be for safety or for conduct of a replenishment at sea, that practice spills over into the responding to an unknown stress that comes out of the blue. Your body will kick into this more automatic response and will waste fewer resources trying to determine what the right action is. So this self-regulation can be built simply through having your people conduct drills, do them consistently, work towards the outcomes that you need, and that will build up that kind of self-regulation. The other piece of this is give your people responsibility along with accountability. It gets them into that practice of being trusted to do something and to do something well, and with the knowledge that someone is going to follow up to make sure that the action has been completed to the right standard. But even more important, that follow-up includes a trusted advisor to help them get to the right outcome if they are having problems. This is not about slapping people down and penalizing them. This is about helping them grow to where they need to be to have that competence and self-regulation. And then the final one, this one is kind of touchy-feely. A lot of people kind of balk when they get to this self-awareness and mindfulness stuff. I don't want you to disregard it though, because the evidence clearly shows that this characteristic is the one that contributes the most to an individual's ability to retain their own internal resources to cope in positive fashions when they're faced with stress. And the evidence also shows that mindfulness training and practice does enhance self-awareness, and it builds mindfulness. So even if you've scoffed at mindfulness before, I heartily urge you to give it a try and try and find a way to bring it into your own organization to serve your people. Okay, let's go to the last slide. I hope you have taken from my remarks how seriously I consider the issue of toxic leadership to be. It is a subject of which I am passionate. I have unfortunately been in a few situations where toxic leadership had ultimate impact on individuals within the organization. I won't name names, but I am convinced that the 2 heart attacks, one of which was fatal, in an organization for which I worked a number of years ago while serving in the Navy, were the direct result of the stress, strain, and impossible battle rhythm that was put on us by the leader of that organization. So literally, the death of one of our people, I attribute to toxic leadership. I take this deadly seriously as a result. And I would urge you all to take it seriously too. You are responsible to make sure that your people do not face that fate. And it is even more stressing that, I would like to stress even more, that because there are ways that you can help them deal with this problem, it makes your responsibility to do so even greater. Okay, I'm going to kick it over to Jenny and see if we've had some questions come in.
Absolutely, ma'am. There's been a lot of robust discussion in the chat room, and we have some folks that are registering some questions in the Q&A. And so please register your questions in the Q&A. But ma'am, I've got a few that have come up. And so the first one, there's been a lot of discussion about how do we deal with this when the toxic leader is somebody who is above us, right? Just because they look better to their superiors, we can talk about how we deal with it, but ultimately, if they're the ones that are writing our fitness reports and our evaluations, no matter how resilient we may be, our careers may still suffer. So what advice or recommendations would you have for folks dealing with a situation like that?
I am thrilled with that question. And one of the reasons I'm thrilled with it is that part of my dissertation thesis was that in large organizations, the person who is causing the toxic leadership environment may be someone that we directly work for, cannot control, or if we tried to control, they would squash us like a bug. And that's at the heart of that question. And here is why my research, I think, has such value to you if you are in that position. First of all, pay attention to those recommendations and apply them to yourself. You need to build your own personal resilience and your own coping skill, your own coping capacity rather, in order to get through that situation. So please take care of yourself. If you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of your people. Second, even if your boss is the toxic leader, you as a leader have some control over introducing these development methods to the people who work for you. You may not be able to benefit the entire organization, but certainly you can work within your own work group, whether it be your division, your platoon, your work group, if you're within the Pentagon or someplace where you don't actually have those kinds of structures. But you can work to help people gain and develop those characteristics that will make them less susceptible to falling into that hole of negative behaviors and harmful behaviors as the result of toxic leadership. So you can make sure that there's time in the day where people can work on correspondence courses or basic skills training. You can set up within your group a shared education process where one person teaches the others. You can set up a mentorship group. One of the interesting pieces of evidence shows that if you build a social group that is able to develop each other, that it is extremely powerful. So part of the outcome of my research, I'm sorry, I've just been joined by two whippets. Part of the outcome of that research is that even if you feel like it is a small action on your part, it can benefit. It can benefit you and it can benefit those people that work immediately for you. I wanted to try and provide the knowledge base with answers that would help someone exactly in that position. So maybe you could also read my dissertation if you care to.
Thank you very much, ma'am. So along the lines of building the resiliency, there's been a couple of questions. And one of those is, if you could give an example of what a drill would be for self-regulation against toxic leadership.
So a drill for self-regulation. Okay, so one of the examples that, believe it or not, it seems unrelated, but in organizations that are safety related, so for instance, firefighters, where they routinely exercise the drills that will allow them to take on a fire and combat it successfully, those groups demonstrated much higher resilience than groups that don't practice any sort of drill. So the bottom line there is any kind of routine drilling will help build that kind of self-discipline. Now, in another way, you could develop your own drill set that wasn't going after an emergency situation, but it could be simply the practice of recitation of a rubric of what your organizational values are. If you start the day together, or once a week you come together for a review of announcements and important information, reading of the plan of the day, if part of that is everyone chanting together the 3 key tenets of your organization, that helps solidify, not only in their mind, but also in their heart, what those values are. And then when faced with a situation, I'll throw out the example of the engineers at Volkswagen who actually developed the software that cheated the emissions tests. And they did it because they were pressured from above to give a result that was not possible. If your people are then faced with a similar kind of situation where they're being pressured to give results that aren't possible, knowing what their own values are as a group will give them the ability to push back and refuse to go along with that kind of fraudulent behavior. And that in turn actually builds their own resilience. Sometimes has bad outcomes for them in the short term. I can't lie about that. But as people, they will be more successful, and for their own emotional well-being, they will be far better off.
Thank you, ma'am. And so on that same topic, we've had several folks asking, how do we practice mindfulness?
So mindfulness is really about being able to observe your situation with impartiality. And it is challenging to do. If there is one of these 3 areas that is more important than the others, it is mindfulness. If there is one of these 3 areas in which I myself do not practice with consistency, it is mindfulness. And that may seem hypocritical to you, but hey, we all do as best as we can. And I do struggle with that. There are apps out there that you can use. Headspace is a good one. That will walk you through a practice of developing your own self-awareness, the payoffs that you get from practicing mindfulness drills. There are courses out there too. If you Google mindfulness training, you will see a lot of different results. And I can't recommend a specific one because you're all over the world. but there are books, there are courses, there are things you can do to develop that mindfulness. And if you are working hard at mindfulness, you will see improvement not only in your own mental well-being, your eustress is what it's called, EUSTRESS, but you will also see an improvement in your relationships with others, because you're going to find that your coping with life in general will be far more based on what the reality is instead of what our wildly negative minds create for what reality is. So, I had a grandmother who was extremely wise. And if I were upset about something that a friend did or said, she would tell us to come up with 3 different scenarios that justified that remark. So for instance, I'll go back to that frowning at me thing. We have a tendency as people, because we're biologically wired to see negative as a way to survive in the wild. Run away from anything negative because it might eat you. Better to be wrong about it being negative and get away than to be wrong about it being positive and get eaten, right? So that's how we're wired. Mindfulness helps you break that. And so my grandma used to say, come up with 3 different scenarios for whatever it is that you're reacting to. Someone's frowning at me. The first reaction is allowed to be the worst case. So the worst case is that person hates me, they don't like me, and they never will. Then come up with a best case. The best case is that person has an upset stomach and they're frowning because they don't feel well. And then you come up with something that's in the middle. And I'm not going to do that one right now because I've obviously started using an example that I hadn't thought all the way through. But my point is you can come up with multiple scenarios that would justify what happened in reality. You will be happiest as an individual if you decide to assume that the cause of that action was the best case, or at least the middle case. But we have this tendency to go to the worst case, and all that does is cause us to expend our mental and emotional resources worrying about it, obsessing over it, convincing ourselves that we are not worth getting anything out of this life. And that's where competence comes back into play. If we demonstrate mastery in something, we build our self-esteem, we build our ability to be successful with mindfulness, we build our ability to self-regulate. These 3 things aren't individual. They work together, they interact together, and overall, they build our ability to manage our resources so that we are successful, not only in our careers, but in our lives.
Thank you, ma'am. Quick question for you. Are you willing to go over time a little bit?
I am.
Okay, we have a lot of questions coming in, and wanted to be able to get to a few more questions. So for those that can hang with us, we'll go over maybe 5 or 10 minutes. And if anyone needs to drop off, we're glad you joined us, and this will get posted on our YouTube channel afterwards. Ma'am, one of the questions that came in is, how is the military dealing with toxic leaders as an organization?
Organizationally, the military thinks that our hierarchical structure is going to work. You give an order and people will follow it. We all know that that's not really true. In many cases, yes, it is. But for things like how people think, how people act, it is simply not the case where you can order people to not tolerate toxic leaders, and then boom, that happens. Unfortunately, the military's approach to this has been, we can prevent a permissive environment from existing. They're trying to remove that edge of the toxic triangle. They also think that we have the UCMJ. We can successfully find toxic leaders and we can eliminate them or rehabilitate them. But the reality is, and I've seen this happen too many times, The reality is you have a toxic leader who does get identified, who does make it onto the radar of the senior leadership who earnestly do not want toxic leaders. Guess what? Do they make an example of this person? Do they yank him out and fire him? Well, once in a great while they do. But the majority of cases, they will quietly move that person into a different position because they don't want to hurt their career. Look at San Antonio. Look at the incident in San Antonio. And forgive me, my aging brain can't come up with the name of the doctor who actually committed that mass killing at Fort Hood. Well, unimportant. The Fort Hood mass killing. I'm sure many of you are old enough to remember, I hope. In the aftermath of that, in examining the data and finding out why people did not recognize that this guy was on the edge and was about to go over and commit this kind of negative behavior. And by the way, how's that for an example of negative employee behavior in the face of stress and toxic leadership? He killed his coworkers. Why didn't people see this? Well, when you dig into the evidence and the data, people did see this. They saw it multiple times throughout the earlier 3 years of his career. And they said, well, we didn't turn him in because we didn't want to hurt his career. Or the organization did say, you need to do something about this, but we're not going to put it in your record because we don't want to hurt your career. This whole business about putting individuals ahead of the well-being of the organization itself is very troublesome, but it is one that we in the military tend to do because we are so committed to this concept of leaving no one behind, believing that everyone has something about them that can be developed so that they add good. And it leads us to making really poor decisions in situations like this. Now, I want to be clear, I do actually believe that within any individual, there is probably something that you can work on to help make them productive. But in situations like this, we don't have time to screw around with that. You need to make sure that you are taking the action needed in order to prevent that kind of toxic leadership having the horrible impact that it can have on the organization itself. I'm not sure if I answered that question, but it sure was fun.
So, ma'am, somewhat along those lines, there's been a lot of discussions about, resiliency is good. That's good for us personally. But, many of us are striving to leave the organization better than we found it. And so having said that, is there anything that we can do that actually will help change this toxic leadership? That if we are resilient, could that almost be seen as just being more compliant and enabling them to continue being a toxic leader? Or is there something maybe that we could do that will help higher see that, hey, there's an issue and this behavior ultimately needs changed?
So I will say that no, it is not just allowing it to continue on. I would say instead that it is the first step in building the critical mass that is needed to allow people to come forward and be the whistleblowers, to allow people to have that level of confidence that they know their craft, that they know their principles, that they know what is right, that they are willing to speak up. The problem we face right now is that so many of our people don't have that level of conviction, that level of, we've all looked at Maslow's hierarchy, that level of self-actualization that will allow us to sacrifice the potential loss that we might see. We could lose the job, we could lose the pay grade, we could lose the money, whatever. We could end up, in fact, maybe even being convicted in a court. But to have that kind of conviction of our values, to be willing to speak up and out against toxic leaders, we need to start with building people up to the point where they actually have the capacity to do that. Just expecting people to come forward and fight against a toxic leader without giving them the tools to do so is tantamount to bad leadership, in my opinion.
Thank you, ma'am. So there's been a lot of discussion in the chat room and a lot of people giving some personal examples of how a toxic environment just wore them thin. And ultimately, many are attesting to the fact that they ultimately left the organization, or giving examples of folks they knew that left the organization. And it sounds like even some right now that are just really at a low point. And one of the questions we've got is, what is the most basic, specific first step you recommend to help an individual develop better self-awareness, especially if they're at a very low, exhausted, and disheartening point? Because after a while, it does continue to wear.
Examine your own personal priorities. It is clear that those people who were able to start climbing the resilience ladder were those who were able to get straight in their head what was truly important to them. And there are so many different things that can be of valid importance. Your family and your family's well-being, your health, your commitment to what the organization itself is actually trying to achieve. I mean, it is totally fine to be absolutely pissed off at your organization at the same time that you love your organization. It is totally legitimate to see things that are so wrong in your organization while still holding it up with pride. The key is really knowing what values are of the utmost importance to you, and then you can make the decision that not only is going to be the best one for you, but in the longer run, it's going to serve the organization best too. If you can't put those organizational needs for improvement ahead of personal sacrifice, sadly, in many cases, then that might not be the right decision for you. But let me turn that around a little bit. If you know you have people who are struggling with the same kind of situation, one of the most important things you can do is make sure that you tell them that they are heard, that you recognize what they are trying to do to improve the organization, or that you recognize the situation itself. I'm going to share a little personal anecdote. When I was a captain, I was totally at the end of my rope. I was so flat and out of steam. I had been in a situation where the environment was so brutal. Well, it's the one that I just shared with you about 2 people having heart attacks and 1 fatal. And I could not see myself staying in a Navy that would allow this to take place. Well, my boss, who was a 1-star, I wrote my letter. I wrote my letter to leave the Navy, to resign, and I turned it into my boss. And my boss put that letter in her desk for 2 weeks. And she required that I take some leave. And she required that I come back to talk to her at the end of that 2 weeks. And then she laid out for me what she saw wrong with the organization. And she also laid out for me a view of the folks across, not just in my community, but across the Navy, that she thought could help fix the situation. And okay, I'll admit she kind of guilted me out a little bit, but she gave me some time and space to gain some better perspective, or some enhanced perspective, I'll say. And she showed to me what could happen to that organization with me and what might happen to that organization without me. And that discussion helped me get my priorities straight on what I really wanted to happen in the future. And with that, I took a deep breath and I took my letter back. And I stuck in there, and I'd like to think that I've made a little bit of a difference. So you can do that for your people. You can help them see how they can make a difference. You can do that for yourself too. You can tell yourself, I need a break. I need time to recuperate a little bit. And I need time to think about what my priorities, what my values tell me are the things that I can do, the things that I feel I must do, so that I don't have regrets in the future about where this organization may go.
Man, this has been great, and I really appreciate it. I want to be respectful of your time and everyone's time on. So we will have to wrap up. I know we did not address everybody's questions. This definitely got a lot of dialogue going, and this clearly hits near and dear to nearly all of us. So I certainly appreciate your time, ma'am.
Well, perhaps at some point we can do a follow-on, or when we're able to gather in person, we can do some kind of group workshop or something, because having the catharsis of just moving through what has happened to you can be very healing.
I would imagine so, ma'am. Based on the conversations in the chat room, it sounds like maybe there's some of that going on, you know, during this past hour, just that great dialogue.
Well,
And I'm going to actually get back to that. Although I will just mention, because this popped up on the screen here, please join us for our next session, which will be Monday, August 31st, Amazon Operations and Military Recruitment. So we'll continue on with our Jules Leadership Symposium, or series rather. And so we look forward to having a very different topic, obviously, probably more focused for those who are transitioning, but definitely spread the word. That should be a good session. Hit us up on social media. I know there's been some requests to have a link perhaps to the dissertation. And so Admiral Hamby, if you're okay with that.
Absolutely okay. And if people are eager to get it, if you Google Hamby attributes toxic, it should pop up within the first couple entries. The full name of the dissertation is The Role of Employee Attributes in the Mitigation of Toxic Leadership Impact on Employee Behaviors. But you only need a couple of those words and you should get it.
Great. Well, thank you. So please do, for all those who are listening in, check out all the various social media platforms we have. This session has been recorded and will be posted to our YouTube site. Updates for the rest of the webinars in the series will be posted on our Facebook page, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, you name it, we've got it. And if you are a member of the Sea Services Leadership Association, we have a private Facebook page, and that would be a wonderful place to continue on this conversation. You know, have a group where we can continue this dialogue and have an open dialogue. Also, I just want to give a quick plug for our symposium in 2021. We're doing the virtual symposium this year, and this is our second session, and so far I think it's going very well. But there is something to be said for seeing everyone's smiling faces, you know, face to face. And so we're looking forward to that in Norfolk in the summer of 2021. So keep that on your calendars. Again, follow us on social media and get the updates for that as we get those rolled out.
Hi, Corey. Sorry, I just opened the chat. I just saw my former aide in there.
Absolutely, man. There's a lot of shout outs going on. So with that, I will close out the session. Appreciate those of you hanging with us. I know we're about 12 minutes over. This was very valuable, very informative. Again, an excellent topic. Join us for our future sessions. Admiral Hamby, thank you very much for your time.
It was my pleasure.